Well, welcome to Watercolor. I'm going to go ahead and get you started on your watercolor techniques. Most of these are made for the Painting 2 class, but some of these you could also use in Drawing 2 for the watercolor assignment that we have with our illustration. I'm going to go over some watercolor basics. You have a set of brushes in front of you, and so the brushes that I have are kind of multi-purpose sort of brushes. Some are flat, some are round. The one I'm going to use is a Sumier brush. Let me get this in the camera. A Sumier brush. It's actually a Chinese calligraphy brush, but anything with natural bristles will hold a lot of paint for you. So like a sable brush, like the Crayola sets that the Drawing 2 class has, will work really, really nicely. And so the key with watercolor is that you need to use a lot of water. So basically to activate the paint, you get yourself some water in a brush, you mix it into the color, and then since we're kind of trying to mix colors here instead of just using them as we see them, I'm going to go ahead and put it in one of the wells in the palette. And the more water I add, the lighter the color gets. But the orange that I'm using is really, really bright. So if I want to dull down this orange, what I need to do is either use its complement, which would be blue, or maybe some gray. But I'm going to use a little bit of the complement. I'm just going to use a little bit of it so that it becomes more of a kind of a pumpkin-y sort of orange color. So you can see how the color is a little bit duller. What I'm basically going to do is go through the technique sheet with you and do this step by step. What we'll do is we'll try to do some do's and some don'ts of watercolor. So you can follow along with your demonstration sheet and you can watch this and repeat it as many times as you need to. I'm going to go over the basic techniques first. One of the first things I want you to do is make sure that you mix your colors like I just showed, but we're actually going to do two techniques that are things that you probably don't want to do a lot. The first thing is to bruise your paper. Basically, when you're painting, you want to use a watery color. You start light and kind of work dark. You make a basic sort of wash. Okay, so a wash, you kind of just rotate the brush back and forth. If you want to sop up some extra color, because that will dry darker, you can use a brush to kind of sop it up and then dry your brush off onto something else. When the paper is wet, you don't want to be mean to it. If I take a brush like one of these flat brushes with the red, and then I scrub at the paper, like let's say I've made a mistake, what will eventually start to happen is you're just going to start to pill the paper. And so what will happen is as the paper gets bruised and you're kind of mean to it, the pigment will attach itself to these little fibers of the paper. Or if I went in there and I drew with like a pencil, it's going to forever scratch the paper and damage it. And I can never go back and erase it. So you want to be really careful that you don't scratch it or hurt it or scrape across it, because what will eventually happen is the paint's going to collect in those areas where it's bruised, and those things will remain forever. So you don't want to do that. You can see here how the color's kind of trapping into the part where I bruised it. So try not to be mean to your paper. Paper is paper. It will curl, and if you add too much water, it's going to fall apart. Another thing that you want to be careful about with watercolor is what we call a water blossom. So typically what a water blossom is that you'll put some paint down and then you'll go back in a few minutes and try to add something to it. And once the paper starts to dry, what you often get is a repelling of it. So if I'm just going to drop some water here, what you'll start to see is on the edges of the drop, the color is getting darker. It's like pushing the color out. And when that dries, you're going to see that there is a ring around the color, and it's going to look like a big water puddle just landed in your artwork. Now, that could look really pretty if you made it look intentional. But if you wanted something to be nice and smooth, then that's going to forever be like that. So if that thing happens where you accidentally just drop water, your best solution is to go back over with just clean water or pigment again and go back over the entire section again. So if I just go back and forth, it will smooth it out. So as long as it's still wet, you can fix it. Okay, so let's review just a flat wash. A flat wash is I just want one sort of solid color. So I'm going to use my burnt orange again, right? And I'm going to just take with lots of water, because a wash means water. Okay, so we want the color to be thin, not thick. What you're going to do is take your paintbrush in whatever section you're working in, and you're just going to go back and forth, back and forth. And basically you have this bead of water here, and you're pushing and pulling it back and forth. And so when you're done, sometimes you'll have a bead of water, and you'll want to go back in and kind of sop it up. Sometimes some of these brushes sop up a little bit too much, so you might have to figure out what brush will actually work better for you. Okay. The last section that we have is this gradiated wash. I'm going to rotate this a little bit so we can see this a little bit better. A gradiated wash is where a color changes in value. So it's going to be basically going from light to dark. So if I want to make the color darker, I have to add more pigment to it. So what I'm doing is I'm going back to my palette, I'm adding more orange, right, using a little less water. I'm adding some blue, right, to dull it down, and I want that to be really kind of a strong color. It still has lots of water in it, but it doesn't have a lot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and put a row of color in, and I'm going to take some water. I'm going to add water to it. So as I pull that bead down and I add more water, so each time I'm taking my brush away, I'm adding water to this. I just kind of go back and forth, it's going to bleed. And it's kind of nice on your tilted tables that gravity will kind of pull it down in a feathery way. Now if I go back up to the top, it's going to erase what I've done. So it's really important that you work from top to bottom as you go. And let's say I wanted to get a little bit darker and I've made an accident. What I can do is go back to that strong color again and put the color back at the top. Now if I just leave it like that, I'm going to get that water blossom. So what I want to do is kind of massage it back and forth. Sometimes I have to go back into the clean water to get it to go gradually down to light. So if you need to change something in value from light to dark, this is a really good way to do it, especially like a sky or some simple sort of value. If you have any complex value, you would actually want to wait and do it section by section, which I will illustrate later. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do, and remember if I'm going too fast, pause it so that you can catch up. The next thing I'm going to do is a variated wash. Variated wash is basically going from one color to another. And so what I'm going to have you guys do is go from one color to another. I'm going to have you try it doing an analogous color and maybe a complementary color, so a color that's not next to each other on the color wheel. So I'm going to do green and blue. So what I'm going to do is get myself some green. I'm going to use one section of it, right? And then I'm going to put blue in another section of it. And what I'm going to basically do is bring that bead of water up to the green section so that I get a gradual transition. So basically what I'll get is I'll get green, blue, and a blue-green. Okay? Now when I was doing that, you know, I was a little over anxious and let it kind of peel up because my paper is warping a little bit, so I can suck up some of that extra color as it appears. So if you have like a sunset, you can do that in one fell swoop as long as you have a big enough brush to go from one color to another. Okay? Variated wash of complementary would be the same sort of thing. So basically I would take maybe this time red, okay, take red, go one section red, and then I'd start at the bottom with like my green. Okay, and I'd bring it up to the red so that it starts to make kind of a brownish, dullish color in the center. Okay, so when this starts to dry, you can see that watercolor is very feathery. It's very, very light. Okay, now there's going to be times when you're going to want to paint wet on wet and wet on dry, and these are things that you normally want to let dry. So for wet on wet, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip charging for a second. I'm going to go to the wet on dry and the glazing section. All I'm going to do here is put down some flat washes of color. So just a little bit of review. A flat wash, go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I'm going to let these things dry while I'm working on some other things above. And so then I'll be able to add some details to these as we go through here. Okay, so you can see I'm kind of losing my water. So if I just kind of go back in and add water and then go back and forth, I can get that kind of flat wash to up here. Okay, So I'm going to go here. And these don't all have to be the same color. I'm just making them there out of like making it go a little bit quicker. But you can do these any color that you want for the base. Okay, so I'm going to let these things dry as I go back up and work on the other sections. Okay, now some objects you want to have some feathery details. Like let's say you're doing sky. So for sky, you know, your sky might be blue and white with like white clouds. So maybe you want to use some clear water for the clouds. And then, and mine's a little tinted orange from my paint, but you can sort of see it still here. So that's just some clean water. And then if I want to go in and put some other colors in kind of feathery, I can kind of drop them in. And so when you do wet on wet, the detail is going to be very feathery. It's going to have kind of that blossom sort of effect. This is a good water blossom. So if I'm trying to make clouds and make them look fluffy, I'd want to use the wet on wet technique. Charging, which is very similar. It is wet on wet. Charging is basically where you're changing the value of something. So if I wanted to do, like let's say I have a sphere. Okay, so I've done a sphere. Okay, now right now it just kind of looks round. If I wanted to lighten it, I could suck up some of the highlight. I could lift it with my brush. I normally would just start with it really light, and then if I wanted the shadow to get actually a little darker while it's still wet, I can take some more orange and just use that wet on wet technique of charging, adding the orange to the shadow to make it a little bit darker. So charging is typically where you use the same color, just a different value of it to make it get darker. Okay, so charging, that's the same orange that you see in the background. Okay, now I'm going to let the wet on dry and the glazing dry a little bit. So I'm going to move on to the lifting one, which I think is number 12 on your handout. I actually just did that with the charging. So let's do lifting one more time, because this is something, a skill that you do all the time. Okay, let's see if I can get this to work here. My paper's not quite the right side for this recording device. Okay, we'll just do it off to the side here. So with lifting, if I'm painting in, sometimes I accidentally go too dark. So for lifting, if you remember, you can take a drier brush to wipe away some of the paint, and I'm being gentle with it. I'm not being abusive. I'm not drying it. I'm not scrubbing at it. Another thing I can do is just take some paper towel and I can blot it up too. Sometimes that makes a really cool texture if you're looking for texture. If you're just making it lighter, then you can be really precise about it and blot it up while it's wet. If the section is completely dry and you want to lighten it, you can do the same thing. You can take some clean water and blot it up, but it will never go as light as it did when it was still wet. Okay? So let's go ahead and finish up our dry techniques. Wet on dry and glazing is what you would do to add details. So wet on dry would be layering. So you always start with a base of color. So like a background color, a general color of your object. And then you've got to put the texture and the detail on top. So you'd want to use a smaller brush, something that would be good for detail. So any of your smaller brushes are going to work. The red ones are going to be nice to add some details. So if I just wanted to add some linear elements to it, like let's say I've got some ridges to like a seashell or something, I can go in with my detail brush and I can layer those details on top of each other. I think I'm using too big of a brush. Let's go get something a little bit smaller here, like maybe my real small detail brush, and I can use this to layer whatever detail on top that I need. Okay, as long as the paint's not too runny and you've let the area dry really well, it should have nice crisp edges rather than the feathery technique that you get on the wet on wet. Now the glazing technique is something that you'll do primarily for cast shadows. This is a great way to layer imagery. So for like painting too, you could layer one shape on top of another shape and still see the shape underneath of it coming through. Or in like drawing 2, if you need to make a cast shadow, this is a great color of putting a cast shadow on top of a background color. So what I would do here is I would make a wash. And in glazing, I'm asking you to do an analogous color and a complementary color. So the opposite of orange, once again, is blue, and I want to make a wash of blue. Okay, so it's got to be really watered down because I want to see the orange underneath of it. So if I just do a stripe of light blue on top of the orange, you can see that the colors aren't mixing. You can literally see the blue layered on top of the orange. Okay, so if I wanted to drop a shadow on top of something that was orange, I could do that. Of course, the shadow doesn't have to be blue. It could be any color that you see. But notice, a lot of times shadows aren't necessarily gray. They are sometimes color. So you have to look very carefully to make sure what color it is. It also could be just you're making some sort of detail. And you just like this effect of layering. I love to work in layers. So feel free to do this layering technique, especially in the watercolor assignment for painting 2. I can use other colors and layer them on top of each other too. So here, maybe a little bit too light. Let's try something maybe a little bit darker. I can layer the red on top of the orange and still see the orange shining through. So those are your basic watercolor techniques. Listen to this as many times as you need to review them. I'll make a second video for the more complex ones.